I remember the sound of the fire more than the flames themselves, the way it roared like a beast straining against chains, how it devoured air until breathing became a punishment, and how the wood of our family home cracked and screamed as though it too wanted to survive. I remember clutching the banister until the heat blistered my palms, and Daniel, my little brother, my shadow, the one who used to follow me through the woods with questions I never answered fast enough, was trapped upstairs, his voice calling my name in a pitch that still punctures my dreams. And I remember the last thing I saw before the world collapsed into smoke, the reflection of men in dark coats standing at the tree line, their silhouettes unflinching as the fire painted their faces orange. They did not move to help. They did not raise alarm. They watched, and when the blaze reached its crescendo, they disappeared into the blackness as if the flames themselves had swallowed them whole. The coroner called it an accident, an electrical fault, a tragedy of faulty wiring in an old home. And though my body bore the marks of survival, skin grafts across my arms, hair burned away in ragged patches, lungs scarred with smoke, the world decided my soul should carry blame instead. They said I left candles burning, they said I neglected routine maintenance, they said I was reckless, and the insurance lawyers whispered behind polished desks that negligence was cheaper to prove than conspiracy. I screamed in courtrooms until my voice was nothing but a rasp. I begged them to test for accelerants, to examine the ground where the men had stood, but the reports came back sterilized, clean, neat as an architect's ruler, and soon my name was not just associated with fire but with shame. I lost everything in weeks: my family, my home, my work at the city planning office, my reputation in a town that had once nodded warmly when I passed. People crossed the street now rather than meet my eyes, as though survival itself was a stain, as though grief was contagious, and when I stood in line at the market I heard the mutters, "That's her, that's the Crane girl, the one who burned them all." The whispers wrapped tighter than any bandage, and though I tried to fight, though I walked into City Hall with binders of evidence and maps of the fire's impossible spread, no one listened. The truth had been buried under polished statements and neatly typed press releases, and the hands that buried it belonged to men who never smelled the smoke, men who never heard Daniel screaming, men who thought ash was the perfect eraser. At first I thought of ending it, of silencing the pain with pills, of joining the voices I lost, but every time I pressed close to the edge something deeper yanked me back, not mercy, not faith, but fury, a fury that refused to let those men sleep peacefully in their beds while my family's bones turned to dust beneath the soil. And so I began to walk, to wander places I once feared, construction sites, abandoned factories, hollow churches where candle wax clung to broken altars, and everywhere I walked I listened to the language of fire. I studied accelerants, I studied ventilation, I studied how flames travel across structures, how heat weakens steel, how oxygen feeds destruction. And the more I learned, the more I realized fire was not only ruin, it was truth. For fire leaves patterns, scars that tell stories if you know how to read them, stories that courts ignored but which could not lie to me. In the ashes of my home I found the first clue they had missed, or had chosen to bury, a circle of char so precise it could not have been accident. A burn ring where accelerant had pooled and bloomed upward, and when I bent low I found fragments of a glass bottle melted into the soil, shards with a manufacturer's mark etched faintly into the rim. I traced that mark through databases and city archives until I found the company, one tied to a contractor that had bid on a series of suspicious demolitions over the last decade. Demolitions that had all ended in unexplained fires, demolitions that had cleared land for luxury towers. The men at the tree line were not strangers. They were erasers, cleaners, arsonists wearing respectability like a uniform. My hands shook as I traced the connections, the addresses, the bank accounts. But beneath the shaking there was resolve, because knowledge meant the fire had not taken everything. It had left me a weapon. I was not going to beg anymore, not going to plead in courts that silenced me, not going to kneel at graves praying for justice that never came. I would burn my truth into the world the way they had burned lies into mine. And so I began to design not just revenge but resurrection, not the meek survival of a broken girl but the creation of something they could not ignore. A figure who walked through flames untouched, who returned what was taken with interest, who left behind not silence but symbols. I stitched my veil from scorched silk, blackened but gleaming in light, a veil to hide the scars they left and to show the world I had shed the face they mocked. I wrapped myself in dark coats lined with ash-colored threads, I carved into my pendant the fractured emblem of a flame curling into a circle. And I took a new name whispered first in my own mouth, then in the shadows of alleys where my reflection no longer frightened me. I became the Ash Veil. The first night I walked in that skin I returned to the office of the insurance lawyer who had laughed when I begged for a second investigation, who told me grief made women hysterical, who called Daniel's death unfortunate collateral. I stood outside his tower of glass and steel and watched as he burned the midnight oil smug in his immunity, and I whispered my promise into the wind, that every man who profited from my family's ashes would one day choke on smoke of his own making. I did not strike that night, not yet, because revenge, like fire, needs patience, it needs fuel and timing and the right gust of oxygen. But standing there, hidden beneath the veil, I felt power for the first time since the fire. I felt alive. They thought fire had erased me. They thought silence had buried me. But I am still here. And when I return, I will not come with pleas or petitions or paperwork. I will come with fire in my lungs, with ash on my hands, with Daniel's scream carved into my memory like scripture. I will come as their reckoning. And the city will know my name not from scandal or whispers but from fear, because I am not what they burned away. I am what rose from it. I am the ash veil. They thought the silence after the fire meant I had been defeated, that grief would swallow me whole until I withered into another forgotten name carved into marble, but silence is never defeat. Silence is the sound of a blade being sharpened, the pause before the storm, the inhale before fire explodes into a scream, and in my silence I became something they could not measure in courtrooms or bury in paperwork. I mapped every address tied to the contractor, every name signed on demolition permits, every lawyer who had stamped papers that dissolved questions into ashes, and I studied them with the same intensity one once studied city blueprints. Their routines became my scripture, their arrogance my compass, and in time I understood that to topple an empire built on fire, I must become fire itself. The city at night no longer frightened me, it belonged to me, every shadow a cloak, every rooftop a perch, every alley a corridor carved for my footsteps, and in that city I began to plant seeds of fear. At first, small interruptions. A car belonging to a subcontractor found charred on the edges of the industrial district, no fingerprints left behind except the faint outline of a circle of ash on the hood, an office of a mid-level accountant mysteriously burned in a controlled blaze that spread no further than his filing cabinet, every incriminating document gone while the rest of the building remained pristine. Whispers in construction crews that a woman in a veil walked through their sites at night, leaving symbols drawn in soot on their blueprints. They laughed, they scoffed, they dismissed it as urban myth, but myths grow teeth when repeated, and soon their laughter turned into glances over shoulders, hands tightening on steering wheels, alarms double-checked before sleep. But fire does not thrive on fear alone, it thrives on fuel, on oxygen, on escalation, and so I built my revenge like one constructs a blaze, kindling first, then flames, then inferno. The kindling was a man named Bradley Shaw, the project manager whose signature appeared on the most suspicious permits, whose bank account swelled every time a tragic accident cleared land for towers, whose smile in photographs was wide enough to hide the screams he ignored. I followed him for weeks, noting how he left his office late, how he drove to a glass-fronted townhouse in the northern district, how he poured whiskey until his speech slurred, how he slept without checking locks, and on the night when rain fell hard enough to mask footsteps I stepped into his home with gloves slicked in oil and silence wrapped tight around me. He woke to the sound of crackling, confused stumbling toward the glow that spread across his living room rug, and when his eyes lifted he saw me for the first time, the veil of scorched silk, the coat threaded with ash, the emblem of flame carved into my pendant, and though he did not know my name he knew instinctively what I was, consequence. He begged, he stammered promises, he said he was only following orders, but I had heard those excuses in courtrooms and insurance offices. In every place where accountability was bartered away, and I whispered only one truth before I vanished into the storm: this is not an accident. When the fire trucks arrived they found his home gutted, his body alive but broken by burns that would never heal, and painted on the soot-black wall above his bed was my symbol, the circle of flame. The city woke with gasps the next morning, newspapers splashed with photographs of the Mark reporters speculating whether it was vandalism or terrorism or cult ritual. But those who were guilty knew exactly what it meant, and fear began to choke them harder than smoke. Contractors called emergency meetings, lawyers sent encrypted messages, politicians who had taken their money held whispered conversations behind locked doors, but fear cannot be contained when its source is unknown, and the unknown was me. They began to dig, to search police databases, to bribe detectives for leads, but I had shed Isolde Crane like a snake sheds skin, and the woman they thought they buried in scandal no longer existed. There was only the ash veil, and the ash veil was not bound by law. Still, revenge is not satisfied with one flame, it demands a chain of fires, each brighter than the last, until the guilty are surrounded with heat so suffocating they cannot breathe without tasting smoke. My second blaze was not a blaze at all but a revelation. A file leaked into the hands of a reporter I once trusted, a woman who had offered me sympathy before the courts devoured me, a woman who believed in truth even when it cost her. I left the file on her doorstep in the dead of night, documents stolen from a contractor's safe during one of my intrusions, papers proving payments to city officials timed precisely with each suspicious fire, names and dates that cut through lies like a knife through canvas. She ran the story with trembling hands, her newspaper splashing corruption across its front page, and though they tried to bury it with denials and threats. The symbol of the flame circled every headline, tying truth to fear until even the most skeptical citizen began to whisper that perhaps the ash veil was not myth but justice. They called me a terrorist. They called me unstable. They called me dangerous, and perhaps all of that was true, but in the whispers of the broken, the evicted, the families who lost homes to the flames, I became something else entirely. I became hope. Hope wrapped in smoke, hope armed with fire, hope that those who burned without consequence might finally feel the heat of reckoning. And with every whisper of hope my resolve sharpened, because revenge is sweetest when it transforms from personal hunger into collective anthem. But anthem or not, the men at the top still stood untouched, their towers gleaming above the city like fangs, their smiles sharp enough to convince investors that everything was under control. And to reach them I would need more than fire, I would need shadow, misdirection, patience. For months I stalked their meetings, bugged their cars, mapped their supply chains, and slowly the puzzle formed, the same three men always at the center, three architects of ruin, three faces who had stood at the edge of my forest the night Daniel screamed, three silhouettes etched forever into my mind. Their names, Victor Harrow, Damon Creel, and Ellis Brandt. Executives, philanthropists, men who donated to charities while siphoning millions from tragedy, men whose portraits hung in galleries while bones turned to ash beneath their feet. To bring them down would require a fire unlike any I had set before, not one that destroyed a home or burned a symbol into walls, but a fire that consumed their empire from the inside, a blaze that no lawyer could smother, no politician could redirect. And so I prepared, stockpiling accelerants not of gasoline but of secrets, bank records, photographs, confessions, until I had enough fuel to ignite not just their reputations but their legacies. Still, information alone could not suffice. I needed spectacle, a moment seared into public consciousness, a night when the ash veil stepped from myth into undeniable reality. The night came with winter, when snow softened streets and breath turned to fog, when the city gathered for the annual gala hosted by Harrow, a glittering event where politicians toasted glasses with men who bled the city dry. I walked among them unseen, veil hidden beneath a simple mask, dress black as soot, and no one looked twice, because power never imagines its prey walks beside it. I waited until the chandelier lights reached their brightest, until champagne glasses clinked, until Harrow took the stage with words about progress, and then I cut the power. Darkness fell like a curtain, gasps slicing through the room, and in that silence I lit a single flare, crimson flame bathing the hall, my silhouette cast against marble walls like a prophecy. I spoke then, not in screams but in steady words that carried through the hush. For every family you erased, for every scream you buried, for every fire you fed with greed, your reckoning has arrived. I am the ash veil, and I am not here to beg. I am here to burn. Panic erupted, guards scrambled, guests fled, but I remained calm, tossing envelopes into the crowd, each one filled with documents of corruption, each one a spark to ignite truth, and as chaos consumed their gala I vanished into smoke grenades, leaving behind only the symbol of flame carved into the stage. The city could not look away now. They could not dismiss me as accident or rumor. The ash veil had spoken, and the empire of Harrow, Creel, and Brandt trembled under the weight of fear and truth combined. They doubled their security, they unleashed private investigators, they bribed news outlets to smear my name, but every effort only proved their desperation, every denial only amplified the fire already spreading. And though they tried to rebuild their narrative, the cracks widened, investors pulled back, allies distanced themselves, and in the shadows I smiled, because revenge was no longer mine alone, it was the city's. But fire consumes all, even its wielder, and though I had risen from ashes stronger, each step deeper into vengeance carried cost. Nights bled into mornings with no sleep, scars reopened as I stitched wounds in silence, hunger gnawed as I lived in abandoned warehouses, and sometimes in the echo of Daniel's voice I wondered if he would recognize what I had become, if he would see justice or monster, sister or ghost. Yet hesitation is a luxury revenge cannot afford, and as long as the men who watched him burn still drew breath, I had no right to stop. I would see this through to the end, even if the end swallowed me whole. The city believes the ash veil is unstoppable. The guilty believe they can still bury me. The truth is simpler. I am a woman who lost everything and found fury, and until Harrow, Creel, and Brant choke on smoke as Daniel did, I will not rest. The fire has only begun. They thought doubling their guards would shield them. They thought cameras and hired hunters could catch me, as if fire can be caged, as if smoke can be handcuffed, as if vengeance can be bought off with men carrying rifles and paychecks. They underestimated what I had become, because I was no longer a woman grieving in silence. I was a force they created. A ghost they summoned, a storm they fed until it swallowed the sky, and now that storm had only one direction, toward them. Harrow, Creel, and Brant, the architects of ash, the men whose silhouettes still stood in the corners of my memory, framed by flames as Daniel screamed. Their empire cracked in the light of exposure, their allies scattering like rats from a sinking ship, but still they clung to power with claws sharpened by wealth, and so long as they lived, justice remained unfinished. I watched them retreat into their fortress, a tower of black glass at the heart of the city, 30 stories high, lined with cameras, swarming with guards whose eyes scanned the streets below as if waiting for me. And waiting they were, because fear had twisted into obsession, because every shadow now carried my face in their imagination, because every creak of the wind was mistaken for footsteps, because they knew I was coming yet could not know when. That was my power, not strength, not weapons, but inevitability. They knew the ash veil would arrive, they just did not know how. For weeks I circled them, testing the edges of their defenses, slipping past cameras with smoke grenades, leaving faint traces of soot in hallways just to prove I had been there, whispering my presence until paranoia devoured them from the inside. I wanted them exhausted, I wanted them brittle, I wanted the empire they had built to rot beneath their feet, so that when the final fire came they would not stand tall but collapse in terror. And when the city announced their emergency shareholders' meeting, a last attempt to salvage what reputation they had left, I knew it was the moment. Because the city would gather, the press would swarm, and in that crucible of attention I would strike the match that could not be ignored. I prepared not just with accelerants but with truth, drives filled with files, recordings of their confessions captured by hidden mics, photographs of handshakes over corpses, accounts that traced money from ashes into gold. All of it ready to scatter into the world, all of it set to ignite like gasoline once released, because revenge without proof is myth, but revenge with evidence is gospel. And gospel spreads like wildfire. The night came cold and brittle, the kind of night where the city's breath hung in the air and footsteps echoed sharp against stone. The kind of night when silence carried tension as if the streets themselves held breath. I walked beneath my veil, coat heavy with the tools of reckoning. And though my hands trembled, it was not with fear but with the weight of Daniel's memory pressing against my chest. I saw him in the glass reflections as I passed, a boy smiling, a boy screaming, a boy silenced, and I whispered to him that tonight he would be avenged. The tower rose above me, black glass gleaming under floodlights, and inside its upper floors I knew they sat with their lawyers, their investors, their security detail, pretending control while sipping whiskey with shaking hands. I slipped through the service entrance timed with a delivery truck, shadows wrapping me tighter than skin, and floor by floor I climbed, disabling alarms, cutting wires, planting charges not of explosives but of smoke canisters, designed to choke the air and scatter the powerful like insects. By the time I reached the 29th floor, the smoke was already crawling, and chaos had begun to ripple. I burst into their boardroom with fire at my back, the flare in my hand painting walls crimson, and for the first time since the night of the fire they looked directly at me, not at reports, not at rumors, not at photographs, but at the ghost they made flesh. Harrow's lips trembled, Creel's hand reached instinctively for a guard who had already fled, and Brant's arrogance cracked into sweat as he whispered my name, not Isolde, not Crane, but Ash Vale. And in that whisper was everything: fear, recognition, consequence. I threw the drives across the table, metal clattering like bones, and told them the city would know their truth before dawn, that every secret they buried was already uploaded, already mirrored across the net, already beyond their reach. They could kill me, but they could not kill what I had released, because fire spreads once sparked, and I had lit an inferno they could not contain. Their empire would collapse not in silence but in screams, the screams of markets crashing, of allies abandoning them, of reputations devoured in the same flames they had fed for years. But vengeance is never content with exposure alone. Vengeance demands a final act, a personal reckoning, a moment where the guilty face the eyes of the one they wronged. So I locked the doors behind me, sealing us in, smoke curling through vents, alarms wailing as sprinklers hissed against heat. And I stepped closer until my veil was inches from their sweat-slick faces. I told them what it felt like to hear Daniel scream, to claw at burning walls, to watch men stand and do nothing. I told them that their greed was a pyre built from bones, that their towers were monuments of ash, that they would carry their sins not into courtrooms but into fire itself. They begged. Men who once held cities in their palms now begged like children. They offered money, safety, silence, exile. But there is no bargain with flame, no deal with vengeance, no compromise with ghosts. I lit the final flare and dropped it onto the fuel-soaked carpet, and fire roared upward with hunger, licking across polished wood and velvet drapes, devouring the room with speed they could never outrun. Their screams rose, mingling with alarms, echoing against glass until the city below lifted its eyes and saw the tower burning, saw the truth in flames, saw the reckoning. I walked through smoke, my veil blackened, my lungs seared, my skin blistered, but I walked, out the service stairwell, through corridors collapsing with heat, down into alleys where snow melted under falling embers, and though sirens shrieked, though voices shouted, no one stopped me. To them I was smoke. To them I was fire. To them I was myth stepping back into shadow. The tower burned through the night, collapsing in sections as sprinklers failed, as water could not keep pace with hunger. And by dawn only a skeleton of steel remained, twisted and charred, a monument to greed undone. Harrow, Creel, and Brant were never seen again, not in courts, not in hospitals, not in prisons. Their legacy turned to ash, their names cursed in headlines, their empire dissolved like smoke and wind. And the city whispered not of accidents, not of negligence, but of the ash veil, the ghost who walked through fire to deliver justice. But justice is never clean. Justice stains. I returned to my hideout's bruised and broken lungs, coughing soot, skin scarred deeper, and in the silence of those walls I wondered what Daniel would see if he could look at me now. Would he see a sister who avenged him, or a monster forged from his screams? Would he thank me, or weep for what I became? There is no answer, and perhaps that is the cost. Revenge does not restore, it consumes. It leaves only smoke where innocence once stood. Still, when I stand on rooftops and feel the wind tug at my veil, when I see towers rebuilt not with blood but with caution, when I hear whispers of hope in families who once lived in fear, I know the fire was not wasted. I know the ash veil is not just vengeance but warning, that corruption burns when faced with truth, that silence can ignite into anthem, that ghosts can become weapons. And though my body weakens, though scars deepen, though the world still hunts my shadow, I remain. Because as long as there are men who believe ash erases consequence, as long as greed builds pyres of bones, as long as silence buries screams, there will be fire. And where there is fire, there will be me. The ash veil.